Saline County, Nebraska, November, 1884. The strangest thing on Thomas Krall's quarter section was not a house, it was a chimney. By the time the first wagon stopped to stare, a 7-foot tower of fresh brick was already standing alone on the prairie, red against the pale grass, with no walls around it and no roof above it. It looked less like the beginning of a home, and more like the surviving core of one that had already burned down. Men laughed, because what else were they supposed to do? A sensible homesteader built his cabin first and worried about the stove later. Thomas Krall was doing the opposite. He was building the heat, before he built the house. Silas Burdett, who owned more cattle than any man within 20 miles and never missed a chance to enjoy being right in public, reined in beside the site one bitter afternoon and looked down from his saddle with theatrical concern. "Krall," he called, "have you decided to winter inside the chimney itself?" A carpenter named Eli Mercer stood beside him, spat into the grass, and shook his head. A cast-iron box stove would have been hauled out and set in place by noon. "You're building a courthouse furnace for a one-room shack." Thomas straightened from the mortar board and wiped his hands on his trousers. He was not a large man, but there was a density to him, the compact strength of someone used to lifting things that did not forgive carelessness. His beard was dark. His face was wind-browned, and his English came carefully, as if each word had to be set in place like stone. "Then it had better work better than a box stove," he said. They laughed again. By supper that evening, people in town were already repeating the line about the Bohemian who had built a chimney and forgotten the house. What none of them understood was that Thomas had not forgotten anything, he had remembered too much. In Moravia, before America, Thomas Krall had not been a farmer. He had been a stove mason. In villages outside Brno, his father and uncles built great ceramic masonry heaters that stood at the center of winter houses and held warmth the way a cellar holds silence. Thomas had grown up shaping clay, laying firebrick, and learning how heat behaved after flame had disappeared. He knew the difference between a fire that roared and a fire that lasted. He knew that a metal stove could make a room feel hot for an hour, and miserable for the next 10. He knew that if you wanted warmth to survive the dark hours before dawn, you could not leave it in the flames. You had to store it. In Mass, when he came west with his wife Marie, their son Joseph, and their daughter Anna, he did what every other homesteader did. He tried to become the kind of plainsman the land seemed to demand.
1883. He and a neighbor raised a plain cabin of cottonwood planks and sod, chinked the seams as best they could, set a cast-iron stove near the center, and stacked wood against the north wall until it looked like enough to survive a siege. It was not enough. The first hard cold that winter came in from the northwest with a sound like freight moving across open country. The wind hit the cabin, and found every weakness within an hour. It slipped through the window casing. It came under the door. It moved through the walls themselves. Thomas learned quickly that a cast-iron stove could glow fierce enough to redden at the joints, while the wash basin at the far side of the room filmed over with ice. The heat gathered close to the stove, rose too fast, and ran up the chimney. By midnight the room would be stifling near the fire and cold at the bed. By 3 in the morning, the stove would be iron and ash again, and the whole cabin would sink toward the outdoor temperature as if it had been waiting for permission. Marie took turns with him that winter, waking in the black hours to feed the stove before the children got too cold. More than once Thomas opened his eyes, and found his own breath hanging above him. Once, after a long north wind, he stepped out of bed and found the floorboards so bitterly cold that the feeling left his feet for several seconds. Joseph developed a cough that lasted half the season. Anna slept in her coat. They cut and hauled wood until Thomas's hands split at the knuckles, and still the stove demanded more. Always more. as though the prairie were eating the fire as quickly as they could make it. Most men on the plains responded to that misery in the obvious way. They burned hotter. They cut more wood. They bought bigger stoves if they could afford them. Tomas lay awake and understood that the problem was not the fire. It was the way the fire was being used. A box stove threw off intense heat while wood was actively burning, but it stored almost none of that energy. The minute the flame dropped, the iron skin cooled fast. Much of the hottest air never warmed the people in the room at all. It raced up the flue and vanished into the winter sky. Meanwhile, the cabin walls stayed cold enough to pull warmth out of blankets, out of bread dough, out of human bodies. Families thought they were heating a house. In truth, they were fighting the entire outside air with a thin metal box and an appetite for firewood. A masonry heater solved a different equation. Instead of feeding a small fire all day and all night, you burned one hot, fast, efficient fire through a carefully built firebox. The smoke and heat did not rush straight into the chimney. They were forced through a maze of internal flues that ran through brick and stone. The mass of the stove absorbed the heat first, and then, hour by hour, the structure gave it back as steady, radiant warmth. No roaring, no violent swings. 90 minutes to keep the room from dying. To men who had grown up with cast iron, that sounded like foreign nonsense. To Tomas, it sounded like home. So when the grass turned yellow again, and the wind took on its fall edge, he made the decision that turned him into a county joke. He would build the heater first, and the house around it. He dug clay from the low bank of a creek bed half a mile away. He mixed it with sand and chopped straw. He shaped more than 1,000 bricks by hand, and dried them in ranks under canvas. He fired them in a long clamp kiln that smoked for 3 straight days, and left the air smelling of baked earth. He set a limestone footing in the center of his future cabin, and began laying the core. Fire brick in the combustion chamber, common brick outside, a broad shoulder on one side where a warming bench would run, and inside the body of it all, a set of narrow channels that would force hot gases to travel before they escaped. Eli Mercer came by often, half curious and half eager for the entertainment. "What happens," Eli asked one morning, "when that whole brick pile cracks from the first hard freeze?" Tomas kept laying mortar. "Then I repair brick," he said. "What happens when your iron stove cools before morning?" Eli had no answer for that, but he had a grin, and the grin was enough. Marie worked beside Tomas without ceremony and without complaint. She mixed mortar. She cleaned joints. She wrapped the children in blankets and set them to collecting chips of dried mud from around the kiln. She had survived the same winter he had, and she needed no lecture on why a different solution was worth the labor. By the time the November geese were flying low, the giant red heater stood complete. Tomas then built the modest house around it. Low walls, small south-facing windows, a tight ceiling, and a room arranged not around appearance, but around the way heat would travel. The stove stood just off-center like the heart of the structure. One side held the firebox door and the oven. The other offered a long brick bench where a child could sleep warm, or dough could rise through a cold afternoon. From the outside, the crawl cabin looked almost disappointingly plain, a squat prairie house with a decent door and little to brag on. From the inside, it looked unlike any home in the county. The stove dominated the room. "Too large," said the neighbors. "Too expensive in labor. Too strange. Too foreign." Silas Burdett took one look through the open door and announced to 3 different people in town that Tomas had built an altar to his own foolishness. Then January came, and the prairie asked its annual question. The storm arrived on a Thursday without grace and without warning enough to matter. A bank of iron-gray cloud pushed down from the north in early afternoon. By sunset the temperature had fallen so fast that wet harness leather turned stiff on the pegs. Then the wind struck. It did not blow in gusts. It pressed. Snow came after it, not in soft descending flakes, but in fine, hard grains that moved sideways and hissed against the walls. By midnight, the world outside the crawl cabin no longer looked like land. It looked like something being erased. At the Burdett place, 3 hired men kept hauling wood to the kitchen entrance, while the big cast-iron stove in the main room roared bright enough to make the stovepipe tick. The family still ate supper in coats. By the second night, the windows were furred white at the corners. By the third, Mrs. Burdett had stuffed folded newspapers into the cracks around the frames, and pushed a rug against the bottom of the door. At the cabin of Ada Blevins, a widow on thin means with 2 young children, the situation was worse. Her woodpile had never been large enough. On the 4th night, she broke apart a kitchen chair for kindling, and fed the stove drawer bottoms from an old bureau. The room smelled of smoke, varnish, and fear. Her eldest boy, Peter, slept with his socks drying against his chest because they could not spare the heat to dry them near the fire. But at the crawl cabin, Tomas lit one fierce evening fire and let the heater do what it had been built to do. The blaze itself lasted less than 2 hours. He fed the firebox hard with split hedge, dry cottonwood, and corn cobs saved in sacks from autumn threshing. The draft through the channels ran hot and clean. The stove made a low rushing sound, not the hungry metallic roar of a box stove, but the controlled breath of something working exactly as intended. Brick after brick took on heat deep into its body. By bedtime, the flames were gone. The room was still warming. That was the part no one had believed. Long after the visible fire had ended, the heater kept giving. Its broad sides released warmth slowly and evenly. The bench held heat through the blankets. The air stayed still because the room no longer depended on a constant blast of rising hot air to feel livable. There were no savage peaks, no midnight collapse. Joseph slept without his coat. Anna woke once only to turn over and press her cheek against the warm bench wall. Marie set bread dough in a crock near the shoulder of the stove, and in the morning found it risen. On the 3rd day of the storm, Tomas performed the small check that mattered more to him than any boast. Before dawn, in the coldest hour, he crossed the room and laid his palm against the outer wall of the stove. It was still warm. Not barely. Warm. Then came the moment that almost broke the whole design. By late afternoon on the 4th day, the wind had driven fine snow and rime ice against the roofline and around the chimney cap. Tomas noticed the draft slackening when he opened the firebox for the evening burn. Smoke hesitated instead of leaping inward. The stove could hold heat beautifully, but only if the chimney continued to pull. If the flue clogged and smoke backed into the room, the family would be trapped in a sealed house with poison in the air and the storm still raging outside. He checked again. The draft was worse. Marie looked up from the table and saw his face change. What is it? Chimney icing. That was enough. No panic followed. Panic wasted time. Tomas took a shovel and a short iron bar. Marie wrapped a scarf across her mouth, jammed a wool cap down over Anna's ears, and told Joseph to stay by the stove no matter what he heard. When Tomas opened the door, the wind hit so hard it seemed to take the breath out of his chest with one hand. Snow had drifted nearly halfway up the frame. He and Marie dug toward the leeward side of the house, then fought their way along the wall, until Tomas could pull himself onto the roof edge. The storm flattened sound, then magnified it, then flattened it again. He could barely see the chimney through the white. On hands and knees he reached it, drove the iron bar up beneath the cap, and broke loose a collar of ice that had begun to choke the outlet. A burst of darker smoke answered at once. He was about to crawl back when he heard something else through the wind. Not the scrape of snow. A voice. A boy was shouting. Peter Blevins appeared first, half blind with cold, stumbling through the drift behind the shed line. Behind him came his mother with the little girl bundled in a quilt. Their stove, once the chairwood was gone, had burned down to almost nothing. Ada had made the choice every prairie mother dreaded: stay and wait for the room to freeze around them, or step into the storm and gamble on reaching another door. They got inside, carrying more snow on their coats than clothing beneath it. Marie stripped the wet quilt away, wrapped the little girl in warmed blankets from the bench, and set Peter's hands against the side of the heater until he winced and began to cry. Ada sat once, hard, on the bench and bowed her head without speaking for a full minute. When she finally lifted her face, her eyes went to the stove, then around the room, confused by the simplest fact in it. There was no roaring fire, and yet the room was warm. That night, 8 people slept inside the crawl cabin while the storm spent itself against the walls. The heater carried them all. On the morning of the 6th day, the wind fell away so suddenly that the silence felt unnatural. The sun came out over a prairie remade into white ridges and troughs. Fences had disappeared. Wagons were only shapes under drifts. At the Burdett place they had gone through nearly half the wood meant to last the rest of the winter. At Ada Blevins's cabin, the water bucket was frozen solid, and the inside of the north wall wore a lace of frost. Silas Burdett rode out after dinner to see the condition of his cattle, and, if he was honest, to confirm what he had been expecting all week: that the Bohemians' absurd brick contraption had failed in some educational fashion. What he saw instead made him pull his horse short. The crawl cabin stood mostly drifted in, but the snow on the roof near the chimney had melted back into a dark, wet oval. A thin ribbon of smoke rose straight upward into the blue air. Most telling of all, when Tomas opened the door after Silas knocked, no desperate blast of furnace heat spilled out. What reached him was something stranger. The interior was simply warm. Evenly warm. Quietly warm. He stepped inside and removed his gloves without thinking. His eyes went first to the firebox. The iron door was shut. No flames flashed through the seam. No stovepipe clanged with overfired metal. He looked at Tomas. "You let it go out?" "Before breakfast," Tomas said. Silas looked at the bench where Peter Blevin's little sister, now pink-cheeked and sleeping, lay under a folded quilt. He looked at the crock of bread rising near the shoulder of the stove. He looked at the wash basin on the stand by the wall, and, without asking permission, reached down to touch the water in it. Liquid. His own basin at home had frozen twice during the storm despite a stove fed until dawn. He straightened slowly. "When did you fire it last?" he asked. "Early this morning," Tomas said. "And last night?" Silas put one broad hand against the brick side of the heater. He left it there. Whatever argument he had ridden over with dissolved under his palm. This was not luck. It was not charm. It was a machine, but a quiet one. A way of keeping what every other man on the plains watched escape up the chimney. "You fool us all," Silas said at last, though there was no mockery left in it. Tomas shook his head. "No. Winter fools the same men every year." The story traveled farther than the storm had. Some of it moved in the ordinary frontier way, by men repeating what they had seen to other men who distrusted exaggeration but trusted details. A warm bench. Liquid wash water. Bread risen after a blizzard. No one who had lived through a plains winter needed those details explained. The rest of the story traveled because Dr. Abram Hale spent a night at the crawl place in February after being delayed on the road between settlements. Hale was not a man given to fantasy. He examined things. He measured them mentally. He looked at the heater, asked Tomas to describe the flue path, sat through an evening firing, and woke the next morning to a room that was still comfortable enough to shave in his shirt sleeves. He mentioned the experience first to a patient, then to the editor of the county paper, then to every homesteader who asked him how many families would come out of winter weaker than they had gone into it. Men who had laughed at Tomas were asking questions with a seriousness they would have found embarrassing 6 months earlier. How wide was the firebox? How many bricks? Did the channels need to rise before they turned? Would limestone do if firebrick was scarce? Eli Mercer, who had once called the thing a courthouse furnace, helped frame a new cabin that summer around a smaller version built for a young couple north of the creek. Tomas did not become talkative just because he had been proven right. He explained what mattered and left the rest alone. Burn hot and short. Store the heat in mass. Keep the house tight. Stop trying to heat the sky. By the autumn of 1885, 4 homes within wagon distance had masonry heaters based directly on his design. Ada Blevins had one built with community help, smaller than Tomas's but enough to keep her children from another winter of smoke and panic. Even Silas Burdett paid cash for a heater in the bunkhouse where his drovers slept, though he did so with the solemn expression of a man who preferred not to discuss the source of his new wisdom. What Tomas Krall brought to Nebraska was not magic, and it was not comfort in any soft or ornamental sense. It was a different relationship to fire. The frontier habit had been to chase heat moment by moment, shoveling more fuel into iron and hoping the room would hold. Tomas understood something older and quieter. A flame is brief. A wall remembers. If you can teach a structure to keep what the fire gives it, then the night loses much of its power. The men who mocked him had measured a house by roofline, by lumber, by the look it gave the road. Tomas had measured it by the coldest hour before dawn, when children coughed, basins froze, and all the boasting in the county counted for less than one surviving ember. He did not build the hottest house on the prairie, he built the one that was still warm when the fire was gone. That was the difference. He had not defeated winter by making a larger blaze. He had defeated it by refusing to let the heat leave.